We're going to be working again on Chapter 6 tonight. I know that in the last week before we ended, I did a little brief intro to Chapter 6 talking about the box model. I understand that that was very, very brief, just to kind of give you a little bit of an intro to work with. And I'm going to repeat all those concepts again because they are that important. And then I'll keep reinforcing them whenever is appropriate during the course. So, especially if you're working on a layout, so that you can get things just right when you're creating pages. What I'm going to do actually to begin is, instead of just looking at our book here, I'm going to bring up a new tab in my browser, and I'm just going to type CSS box model as a search. And of course the top hit is W3 Schools, and they have a nice little diagram here. And I really strongly suggest, like, if you were going to bookmark a resource to prepare yourself for the upcoming midterm exam. You guys hear that? Yes, there's a midterm coming up. Okay, so we're going to do 2 more chapters. We're going to do chapter 7 and 8, and then we're going to do a midterm. Okay. It doesn't really exactly fall in the middle of where we're at, but it does cover, hypothetically, the first half of the materials. All right, so take a look at this little diagram, and this is something you want to become familiar with, at least conceptually, or be able to look it up when you need it to understand. But you're going to discover how this stuff works mostly by just coding and seeing how stuff lands on a page, and then kind of driving yourself crazy as to why it isn't working the way you thought it was going to work. I thought I understood, but I don't. That's the kind of situation you'll get in, and that's absolutely normal, because it can be a little bit of a challenge initially to figure it out. So my goal is to help you figure that out so that you don't fumble through all the same little pitfalls that I ran into when I first learned it, which was completely on my own. I had well graduated and learned my HTML like a good decade or so before, the box model was even an applicable thing. And there were not really good materials out there. W3 didn't have this kind of a website where I could look it up. It was very happenstance. It was very, very, iffy. And then on top of it all the browsers supported it differently. So talk about, a difficult thing to learn, But we have the benefit now where you have a really good textbook that does a great job covering the material. Tons of online resources, and then you have me to help kind of steer you, hopefully, in the right direction. All right, so everything that we do on a page is going to have some sort of content involved. That content will typically be either text or an image or some other sort of an object. That object can include HTML elements themselves, or maybe a media portal, like you have a little thing for video or something. All of those things sit inside of a content container. So at the very least, that white box in the middle will hold the stuff that you're putting on the page. In some cases, and you saw this right off the bat when we first did our first H1 tag and our first paragraph tags, some of those objects by default have a certain amount of styling applied to them, and that's not just the size of the font, but also some of these other components that go with. Now, for example, if I were to create a paragraph tag, it certainly does not come with a border around it. We can pretty much safely say that, unless you want to put one there. But it does come with padding before the first line and after the last line. Same is true with the H1. And now, I want to say this as clearly as possible. When you create content on the page and you start adding padding to it, it makes the object grow in size. So if I have a paragraph and I've declared a width and a height for it, and then I add padding to it, that padding is added in pixels to that object. And we'll go through and I'll show you exactly how that's applied. But it increases the size of the object, and then it pushes inwards from the border. Even if you can't see the border is there. It's kind of like a boundary between countries. Sometimes you build a wall, right? A little political joke. And sometimes there's nothing there. You know, you just walk right over. And for most HTML elements, borders do not pre-exist. In fact, the only ones that I can think of where it pre-exists are tables. Borders are not typically visible. However, if you make them visible, they have to have a size, so at least a pixel, right? And then that adds to the size of the object as well. Margin, though, does not add to the size of the object, and this is a really important concept, but it does create space relative to the adjacent object. So for example, if I have a margin on the top of something, it pushes away from the border towards that other object. It does not make the object bigger, though. Got that? The border makes it bigger, the padding makes it bigger. The margin does not. And that's the one that usually will throw people a little bit, especially when you're trying to figure out how stuff's going to sit on a page. All right, so these are kind of the overviews of those things. But what's nice about working with these are the things that really make your layout not only sit in certain ways, but also help to kind of make things look nice, very frankly. You guys saw earlier on when we were like building stuff and the text goes from all the way from one side of the screen to the other, almost touches the side, and in some cases when we didn't have margin and padding, it would touch the side, and how horrible that looks. That's not how our eye likes to see things. We like to have space around things. Even this web page we're looking at here, you know, this text isn't right on top of that text, and this image isn't right next to that text. There's a buffer, and our eye likes that. It makes it easier to understand what goes with what, how things are organized. And think about websites that you like to go to. Do you go to websites where the text is touching the pictures? Probably not. It's just bad design. So this all goes hand in hand with that. All right, so just a quick review. Content, margin, border, and padding are around every object, whether they have a value or not. They're there. You can enable them by just simply giving them a size, you know, in pixels as to how much space they're occupying. You can also apply percentages and M's as well. Here's an example of creating a margin. Look at the different syntax breakdowns here. Notice that if you're going to declare a margin of 0, now remember 0 is typically the default for a lot of objects for margin. Notice that you don't have to declare the px right there. You guys seeing that? Because 0 pixels and 0% and 0m are all the same thing. That's the rationale for it. If you really want to be safe, I always recommend that you work in pixels if you want to know precisely what you're getting. When you're working with percentages, then you have to do some calculations and anticipations for how things are going to lay. Margin, when applied as one single value, will apply to all 4 sides of the box. So if I were to say a margin of 20 pixels, that's 20 pixels pushing away from the border to the next object. Excuse me. 20 pixels does not change the size of the object. Okay, keep that in mind. If I would like, I can individually declare margins for each one of these. And notice the order. Top, right, should be bottom, left. That's the way it should be. I'm going to fix it. And the reason I use that approach is because that's how they apply. That's why it really kind of surprises me that they did it like that. It should be like this. So it's starting clockwise around the shape at the top, top, right, bottom, left, T, R, B, L, treble. It's a good way to remember it. And that way when you start to apply these collectively, you can do it a little bit more efficiently. You can, in any circumstance, apply margin to any one of those four sides discretely, meaning one at a time. If I just want margin on the top, I can do that. It doesn't have to be all the way around. And in fact, I think most often you're going to find that's what you're doing, especially with margin. You want to come away from the left side of the screen or come down this far below an image. You're going to use margin typically. So you might say something like margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left, and actually say each one of those separately and declare the size in pixels or percentages or ems. But you can use this shorthand technique that you see here as well. So when you see margin listed and it has more than one value provided, this is going to equate to top, right, bottom, and left in that order. So if there's four values declared, those are margins for the sides in that order. If you see less than that, most commonly you'll see either 4 or 2 or 1. This one, for example, pairs them. So it'll pair top and bottom, left and right. So that's a pretty common technique because very often you're trying to balance the position of something, so it's convenient to be able to do it that way. The third one, I always have people look this up because I always forget it, and I had somebody look it up last time, right? When you have three values, I want to say it's top, left, right, and bottom. Somebody look it up and confirm that for me. Don't quote me. Somebody look it up. All right, but that's a shorthand technique. If you are confused by that approach where you're spelling it all out in one fell swoop, just do them individually. No harm done. One thing that's pretty handy, and what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to top, right, left, and bottom. Okay, so that was a pretty good guess on my part, right? Now, I know that he probably shows us this, and I think we saw it last week, and it was probably in the previous chapter, but margin is actually a useful thing for another reason. Using some of the techniques that we can create with margins, we can use margin left, right, auto, and I'll show you this in just a second, to help center objects on the screen. And remember when we took the web page that we were fiddling with, and I narrowed up the wrapper or the container or whatever I called it, and then I gave it a width, and then I set margin left auto, margin right auto, and it centered it on the screen. So I want to give you kind of some techniques. So you see I'm just typing it out. If you guys want to type it out, you can do that. So the object has to have a width declared. So if I try to center something that doesn't have a width, it's not going to do it because it just assumes it's going to fill the whole screen. That's the why. Okay. So must have a width declared. The width So to declare a width, it's usually best to declare it in pixels. And I'm going to tell you what, that's kind of an opinion thing. But everybody else's opinion is not quite as right as mine. I'm kidding. There's just different techniques for doing it. Usually if you're going to use percentages and ems, you usually have some sort of a baseline that you're working from to declare against. So be careful with that one. Declare a width in order to be able to apply this technique. It's a requirement. The other thing that you want to do is set your margins in a couple of different ways. One thing you can do is you can just go margin left, auto, and then you can do margin right auto. And then if your object has a width, so for example, and you use these three styles together, it will center that object within whatever is containing it. Okay, that's a really important part of it. If you're working like we did last time where we had a container or wrapper, I forget what I called it, and it's sitting inside the body's the whole window basically, and I'm giving that a width and I do margin left right auto, it'll appear as though the whole page is centered. If I have a div that sits inside that wrapper and I do a width and a margin left right auto, it'll center inside that container or wrapper, whether that's centered or not. Do you see how that works? So that's one approach for centering things. So if you're looking to get stuff in the center of the screen, that's one way to do it. Another technique that you can use is you can just say margin 0 auto. Now remember, the pixels or percentages or M's are all implied because 0 is the same in all those formats. But if you follow the convention from this slide, that would be top, bottom, left, right, top, bottom, left, right. If I set margins to auto all the way around, it'll try to do it all the way around, but it won't center from top to bottom. So don't make the assumption that's what it's going to do. But left to right will work. So very often you'll see kind of a shorthand. So instead of seeing these two things, you'll just see the width, and then you'll see margin 0 auto. And it's a centering technique. That is not the only way to center things on a page. It's one of the more common techniques. So the other technique that you see very often is just simply using text align center, and that's placed on the containing element. Not the element you want to center, but the element that's holding the thing you want to center. All right, you'll see that in action too. So that's just my quick little guide to centering using margins. All right, padding works sort of like margins, but padding, remember, pushes in from that border. So we have that border element, whether it's visible or not, it's there. And then when we set padding, it pushes inwards from the border, pushes in towards the content, the number of pixels or percentages that we declare. Now, once again, just like margins, it uses all the same type of stuff. So the trouble paradigm, see, he got it right this time. Top right. No, he didn't. Or she. That explains it. No, just kidding. Ladies, I am kidding. But it is top right, bottom left, and don't let that slide tell you otherwise. But same exact principles apply. But here is the difference. The big difference is padding changes the size of the object. So if you were accounting for 500 pixels and you do a padding of 100, it's adding 100 to each side. The width of that object is now 700. And believe me, you'll know when it happens because you've counted 500 and all of a sudden it's not fitting and you're wondering why. So once again, top right, bottom left, top, bottom, right, left, top, right, left, bottom, top, right, bottom, left. That's the procedure. You got to count every pixel, folks. Every single pixel has to be accounted for. All right, so here's a handy little diagram, actually, if you look at it, because they're applying all of these techniques. So obviously the content is the text here. The padding is the space from the edge of that box to the content. and that's in all directions. Remember, if I only set it like one value, it applies to the whole thing. The border, obviously, is the line. That can be declared, size, how thick it is, basically, the type of line that it is, the color that it is. All that stuff can be controlled. And I'm sure there's a slide coming up on it, but the border can be applied selectively as well. You don't have to make the border go all the way around. It can just be on the bottom or just be on one of the sides. And then when you discover that, you can actually use it stylistically. Like I've seen plenty of people that will take, for example, they'll just have a left border and they'll make it like 30 or 40 pixels wide, and it looks like it's got this really cool little offset. You give it a color and it kind of creates this little box that looks kind of neat. And it's not like any graphics or anything like that, it's just border. So it can be used, I think, very effectively. Now the margin, in this case, pushes out from that border away from the object and creates the space. Pushes away. Does not change the size of the object. Am I saying this enough? I hope. Okay. Take a look at this other one here where we do have content. Notice no padding. See the text? There might be like a pixel away from that border, but there's no space. Is that easy to read? No. Your eye does not like it, naturally does not like it. So create space. Chances are you should create more space than you think you should. And that might still not be enough. That took me many years to learn that. I'll try 3 pixels. I'll try 10 pixels. I'll try 20. All right, 60 pixels. You know, it gets to the point where it's like that. Now keep in mind the screen that I'm looking at, this is 1600 pixels across. So in the middle, that's 800, 400, 200. All of a sudden what seemed like it was a lot of pixels is like almost nothing. So be mindful of that. Here's a property that some circles push probably more than I do, but there's this CSS tag here that's called box sizing, and it says default value for width or height is the value only for the content. So you understand what that means? When I say width and height, it's only for the stuff that's inside the content area. That's why I say when we add padding, it changes the size of the object. When we add border, it changes the size of the object. All right, so keeping that in mind with all those objects and their sizes and how those extra components affect it, they came up with this, you know, idea, basically, I'll call it. And it says, and I think there's a typo here, it says the box sizing property is used to select or to direct. So which one do you think is right? It is used to direct the browser to calculate the width and height of an element to include the value for content, padding, and border. So you see this distinct difference there? If you're having a hard time figuring out, all right, I'm 200 pixels wide, I got some padding left, some padding right, they're both different, the border's different, you know, all those little parameters, and then calculating it to be the right size. What this CSS property does is it takes all of that, combines it together, and automatically gives it that size. Now, it doesn't mean that your layout's going to work any better, but it helps to kind of encapsulate it as one object. I'm going to be very frank, this is not a tag I really employ. That's just me. And maybe it's because I didn't learn to do it that way, but I wholeheartedly encourage you to try it. I see people using it all the time pretty effectively. If you're having some problems getting layout items to sit appropriately, that's one thing you might want to try. It's one solution. And I've seen people use it effectively. Now the technique that's kind of interesting here is the way that they're applying this style is they're using an asterisk as the selector. We're not saying paragraph or # wrapper or whatever dot class that they're indicating. They're just using the asterisk, which very much like from a command line DOS standpoint is a wildcard. A wildcard means it will apply to everything. Every item on the page will have this capability. Like I said, I'm usually a little reluctant to apply it in that capacity. But you can see that the author is pushing it, and probably because I'm guessing W3 pushes it too. Should we look it up on W3 and see what they say? All right, so I always like to look at how they define it versus how the author is saying it. It says specify that div elements should have padding and border included in the element's total width and height. So notice that they're giving a width and a height, and they're doing a border 1 pixel solid blue, and they're doing box sizing border box. So what is that doing? What size is that going to end up being? .300 by 100. The space within is going to be 299 by 99. So where in the traditional sense, if I put a border on there, the space that it would occupy would be 301 by 101. Actually, excuse me, 302. Gotta be really careful with that. So the numbers I gave you before with the 99, it would be 298 and 98. Because you're adding 1 to each side, so that means 2 in any dimension, right? So if I added a 1 pixel border on a 300 by 100 object, it would be 302 by 102. And you think those 2 pixels don't matter, but boy, when you're trying to get precise, all it takes is 1 pixel to break the whole design. Just like it takes 1 semicolon to make your CSS fall apart, right? Or for getting a closing, tag on something and it doesn't work. All right, this is an important concept too, and I think it's right around here where I think I'm going to start breaking out my coding tools, and we'll start playing with how these objects sit. There is this concept called basically the normal page flow, the way that the content on the page will flow given its position within the code that you're writing. The general rule of thumb is whatever item that you list first on the page will appear first on the, whatever item you code first will appear first on the page. I've got to say that right. So if I create a paragraph followed by a div followed by a paragraph, in the browser window they should come in that order. Now if I create what they call a normal flow, so if, let's say for example I create this box and then I create this box, and in the code they follow each other, that's how they should appear on the page. If I take this box and write the code so it sits inside of the other object, well, that should sit inside that box, right? That makes sense. But what will happen is you're going to start getting into these situations where you want to take that one item and have it sit next to another item. That's where things start to get a little bit tricky, and that's where we start to throw in this property called float. So what I think that we're going to do here is I'm actually going to pause our video. We're going to take a break. We'll come back and start to code, and I'll demonstrate how these things work. And then you can follow along and play with it as well. Okay? So let's take a good five minutes or so, and then we'll come back and reconvene. All right, I think we're going to try some of those techniques now. And what I've done here is I went ahead and inside of my Web 1 folder and then inside of my Unit 4 folder, since we're still technically on Unit 4, I created a folder called Box Model Demo. You guys can call it whatever you wish, but I'm going to take some of techniques that they're showing here in the chapter and in some of the slides that are upcoming, and just show you how they work from a tangible sense. And I encourage you guys to do the same thing if you're so inclined. It's kind of fun, and when you get your hands on it, I think you get a better feel for how it works and what it all means. I'm going to go into that folder. You can see I've got nothing in there yet, but I have decided that I'm going to be working with Visual Studio Code to do my editing. Not Visual Studio, mind you, but the stripped down version that I showed you a couple weeks back.